Experiencing stress as a private preschool worker. Every worker experiences a certain amount of stress in their lives. Stress can manifest itself in the form of either daily hassles or major stressful life events, and positive forms of stress are known as eustress. Stress is very present within society, but one of the most common forms of stress is known as worker stress. Worker stress is the psychological and/or physiological responses to taxing or threatening events perceived by a worker and derives from two general sources: organizational sources and individual sources. We'll be examining the applications of worker stress within my experience as a private preschool worker. As a teenager, I used to work at a private Korean preschool called Hosanna Childcare. Even though there were other workers, I was constantly having to make sure that not just one, but 12 plus children ranging from ages 3 months to 5 years were kept uninjured and accounted for during playtime, which created a sense of work overload. On top of that, I had to make sure each child was learning certain concepts, eating nutritious meals, sleeping at appropriate times, and keeping well-groomed throughout the day. Some physical demands of this job included being on my feet basically from 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m., actively playing with the children, carrying toddlers if required, changing diapers, and engaging children in kinesthetic exercises. The stress from this job left me physically exhausted, and I always felt soreness in my legs and arms. I was emotionally exhausted from constantly engaging in energetic behavior and child-directed speech, and I was mentally exhausted from having to teach reading, writing, and math to children who had a range of learning paces due to their different ages. All of these stressors influenced my productivity, and by the end of the week, I had minimal energy and was not as engaged in the work I was doing. In order to understand the stressors I experienced as a preschool worker, it's important to define concepts from an IO psychology standpoint. I mentioned the definition of worker stress before and have it listed at the top of the slide. Also, as mentioned before, according to the textbook, sources of worker stress can be either organizational or individual. In terms of my experience, some of the stresses I experienced would fall under task stressors and could be specified as work overload. Work overload has to do with the excessive amount of speed, concentration, or output that a job demands. Providing extensive care for 12 plus children definitely caused me to overexert myself, which led to negative psychological and physiological responses, which we know results in worker stress. That feeling of tiredness and physical strain the body feels at the end of a long day at work could be due to physical work conditions, which can be a source of worker stress when aspects of a working environment become strenuous on one's physical health. In terms of individual sources of work stress, dispositional factors play a role in how prone to stress a worker can be. Being a preschool worker requires patience, energy, and a consistently positive attitude, but according to the textbook, those with type A behavior patterns are characterized as being excessively competitive, impatient, and sometimes hostile, so a person with this type of temperament would find it hard to show patience in a hectic preschool environment and would probably end up experiencing worker stress. Since there are so many sources of worker stress, it's important to research ways of mitigating the harmful effects of these stressors through intervention strategies. Hamwe and others published a scientific journal article that examined concepts of worker stress with the purpose of exploring the types of stressors, specifically role conflict, role ambiguity, and work-family conflicts that contribute to the emotional exhaustion of salespersons and their perceptions of organizational support. The study used structural equation modeling to assess the relationship between the variables of role conflict, work-family conflict, role ambiguity, emotional exhaustion, and organizational support. The study also wanted to test whether there was a direct or indirect link between perceived organizational support and emotional exhaustion. The correlations were measured using Cronbach's alpha scale, and each variable had an established number of measures. The study concluded that all correlations were significant, at p being less than 0.01. Role conflict had a significant impact on emotional exhaustion and role ambiguity, and role conflict had a negative impact on perceived organizational support. Work-family conflict not only had an impact on emotional exhaustion, but also on the relationship between emotional exhaustion and perceived organizational support. What's important to take away from this study is that companies should use these results to reduce emotional exhaustion and increase organizational support in order to increase employee job satisfaction and commitment and to reduce employee turnover. After analyzing the impacts of worker stress on employees, there are several intervention methods that I could use to mitigate stress I experience as a preschool worker. In order to reduce some of the physiological stresses preschool workers experience, I should increase physical well-being. For example, setting a good sleeping schedule would make sure I'm well rested for each day. Also, being sure to stretch before and after work could prevent soreness, and maintaining a healthy diet could keep my energy levels up. A higher energy level would make me feel more positive, which would reduce some emotional stress. To prevent mental exhaustion, I could organize lesson plans several days ahead of time in order to be more relaxed and prepared for teaching. Some organizational interventions an employer could implement would be to promote a team-oriented work environment to reduce work overload. Instead of each preschool worker running around trying to accomplish their own agendas, if the employer provided adequate training programs that could encourage employees to work as a cohesive unit in order to accomplish tasks more efficiently, this would prevent worker burnout and reduce worker stress overall. Thank you for listening.